Hello and welcome to Uncommon Law, my podcast about true stories from my life experience of over 50 years as a lawyer and trial judge. This is a look at the law from the inside out, stuff they don't teach in law school. This is Judge Rudy Greco, retired justice of the New York State Supreme Court. I was born in Brooklyn in the 1940s, and we lived in the third floor of a brownstone. It was like a two-bedroom, a small apartment, with my father, who was a longshoreman, my mother, who was a housewife, and two younger brothers. And basically, those first 10 years at home, our home life was sort of like Ozzie and Harriet with red sauce, you know. It was really a good experience. It was ideal, and everything went very, very well. We had everything we needed. My father could support us on his longshoreman's salary. We didn't have a lot, but we even had the first television, a small Admiral console TV, which was a big attraction in the neighborhood. I remember the house getting filled up on Tuesday nights to watch Milton Berle. We'd have family and friends, neighbors come over. Friday nights, my uncles would show up to watch the Friday night fights from Madison Square Garden. And on Sunday nights, everybody would pile in to watch Ed Sullivan on his variety show, The Toast of the Town. And those were very, very happy days. And just like everybody else and everything else in America, in those days, we had less, but it was more. So in 1954, my dad, with a GI loan and everything else, managed to buy a house. My parents got a house in Flushing. It was a row house, an attached house, one family, and it was much roomier than our other quarters in Brooklyn. It was really nice. And I remember seeing squirrels scampering around the street, and I said, "What is this?" I started looking for Indians with bows and arrows because I figured we were on the frontier. I never saw squirrels in Brooklyn. And everything went well there until it didn't. Very shortly thereafter, my mother and my parents' marriage deteriorated, and we embarked on a horrible 4 years that were as bad as the first 10 years were good. My mother and father had a falling out. They had terrible, terrible arguments. My mother was a avid participant in the school of alienation. She kept trying to turn me against my father. I found out about alienation later on. I was the oldest, so she used to use me as a sounding board for getting angry and all her anger as an outlet with what she felt about my father. And it didn't work because all I did was dig my toes in and defend my father. It had the opposite effect. But notwithstanding all of that, life went on. It was four bad years until they finally separated. And when they did separate, I was actually relieved because I could go to bed without worrying about any violence or any arguments or anything else. It wasn't very, very pleasant. And at that point in time, I was, when they broke up, I was a freshman at Xavier High School, a military school in Manhattan. And I was an angry kid, and I kept getting in trouble at Xavier. And every day I was in detention, which they called JUG, which consisted of marching around a quadrangle for 2 hours with a heavy World War I Springfield rifle. And when they broke up, my mother got a Mexican divorce. She went down to Juarez and got a divorce. I used all of that situation as an excuse to get out of the confines of Xavier High School. I started it in Flushing High School, where there was no discipline whatsoever after 9 years of Catholic school. And Flushing High School was a vacation for me. All I did was cut classes, and I played 45 days of hooky the first semester, and I still passed everything. It was no problem. Flushing High School was very, very diverse, and I was, again, an angry young man, and I loved to fight, and I got in a lot of fights. There was plenty of opportunity, real and imagined, for fights at Flushing High School. Everybody was into it. And I hung out with a bunch of like-minded young guys. We were mischievous. We weren't really bad people or anything like that, but very mischievous. We used to hang out and go, instead of going to class, we would go to the YMCA across the street and have breakfast or lunch in the cafeteria, or up the street, a couple of blocks to a local Horn and Hearted automat, anything but go to school. I spent my career in Flushing High School in the dean's office to the extent where he and I became personal friends. And even after I graduated college and came back to visit Flushing High School some 4 years later, the policeman that was assigned to Flushing High School, known as John the Cop, barred me from entering. He wouldn't let me go back to visit. That was my reputation in Flushing High School. I was also, again, at that time in Flushing, I was into a lot of street fights. And one particular fight just broken up, and I was approached by Red Kelly, who was the local policeman. He was the beat cop. Cops in those days had a walking beat, a regular one, and Red was ours, and he was a very very good guy. And Red wouldn't hesitate in those days to apply guidance in the form of a nightstick across your rear end, if you needed it. And nobody complained about it. But he also cared. And he said to me, he said, listen, if you're so tough, you're always fighting. If you think you're so tough, why don't you find out how tough you are by boxing in the ring? He says, here, I'm going to give you this guy's name. And he gave me a card of a fellow named Bob Koch, who was the youth officer in the 109th Precinct in Flushing, where we lived. And he said, call this guy up. Well, I did, because I thought maybe that made sense. And I spoke to Bob Koch, and he introduced me to an older gentleman who was the head of the 109th Precinct Youth Council, a guy named Larry Macnow, who was a very kindly old gent. And he introduced me to Louis Knowles, who was a steam fitter foreman and a volunteer with the Youth Council. Louis was a golden-haired madman from Florida, and he was, it turns out, a steam fitter foreman who ran the biggest jobs in New York City, installing the very complicated heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems in buildings like 2 Broadway, 2 World Trade Center, 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza, the Americana Hotel, and later on the Shoreham Power Plant out on Long Island. Louis was brilliant, but he was a wild man. And he was, it turns out, he was going to be my manager or my coach in amateur boxing. And it was one of the best things that ever happened to me in my life. Louis had boxed briefly as a pro under the name of Young Otto, and he was a real character. And he took me for almost a whole year, 5 nights a week, to the physical arts gym in Hempstead in Nassau County, where I learned all the basics of boxing, hitting the bag, shadow boxing, jumping rope, the speed bag, sparring, taping up my hands, all calisthenics, road work, everything there was to know, shadow boxing. And it was really, really good. Boxing had a great effect on my behavior then, because now I was getting discipline and learning that there were no shortcuts to doing well, and I also learned to defend myself. Boxing is difficult because at the same time where you're trying to give out punishment, you have to take punishment. And as Louis would say, it is better to give than to receive. You don't want to take punishments. And it's not easy. It looks easy, but it really isn't. And lots of times, street fights, which I was a street fighter, they last 30 to 45 seconds, most of them. Boxing, you're boxing for 3 rounds, which 3 2-minute rounds means 6 minutes, 3 3-minute rounds means 9 minutes. And you have to have stamina and endurance and discipline to do it. It's a very, very, very different thing, and it's a real eye opener for somebody like myself who thought he was a tough guy. So after 1 year or almost 1 year, the Golden Gloves tournament comes up, and I'm 16 years old, and it's a big, big tournament. It's the apex of amateur tournaments. And Louis enters me, and we decide to compete in the Golden Gloves tournament. Now, it's a big deal. The Golden Gloves in New York in those days was one of the big sporting events of the year. And it was divided. They had kids from all over the city, the metropolitan area, and even surrounding states who came to compete because it was a big deal. It was also a step up into a pro career, if that's what you wanted, for some people. It was divided into 2 divisions, the sub-novice division and the open division. And sub-novice meant, in theory, you had less than 10 recorded fights. All amateur boxers licensed by the AAU, the Amateur Athletic Union at that time, would carry a pass book. And when you fought in a legitimate tournament, the results were entered in that book. Sub-novices had 10 or less fights that were recorded. Open fighters had more than 10 fights. Sub-novice fighters fought 3 2-minute rounds. Open fighters fought 3 3-minute rounds. And the whole tournament was open to basically young men from 16 through 26 years old. Now, there were also teams that were competing: the Police Athletic League, the Parks Department, clubs like the Bedford Stuyvesant Boxing Club from Brooklyn or the Salem Crescent Athletic Club from Harlem would compete and get a team trophy at the end of the tournament, depending on who had the best results when the tournament was over. And Lou and I were totally ignorant about the ins and outs of amateur tournament boxing, because the fact of the matter was there were sub-novice fighters who had 50 fights already. They were unrecorded. They would fight in these bootleg fights at boxing clubs around the city. And same thing with open fighters. Sometimes they had 100 some odd fights. They would fight at these clubs where the prize would be a watch. And if you got the watch, you could sell it back for $25 or $50, depending on the watch, to the person who was running those fights. And I was probably the only sub-novice, quite probably the only, or possibly the only sub-novice who was actually fighting his first contest in the Golden Gloves. And there I was, 16 years old. So our first fight, we're assigned to St. Anthony of Padua School Auditorium in Ozone Park in Queens. And my opponent is a 21-year-old guy named Ulysses Jimenez, who was from the CYO, the Catholic Youth Organization Club, and he was coached by Gil Clancy. Gil Clancy was a New York City school teacher who went on to fame and fortune as the manager and co-manager and coach trainer of Emil Griffith, world champion Emil Griffith. And he went on to boxing commentating on television and everything else. Gil was a very competent guy. And my fight was scheduled to be the 14th of 16 fights that was scheduled that night. And that's not good. That's not good, because young fighters like myself with no experience, you burn up tremendous energy and anxiety waiting for your fight. So if you're a canny amateur boxing manager and you have a brand new fighter, you want to get him on one of the very first fights so he doesn't burn up all his energy. By the time I got into the ring after 14 fights, I was practically exhausted when I went into the ring. Not to mention, another thing was wrong, was that I had probably about 30, there were probably over 1,000 people at the fight watching. And I had about 30 family, friends, and neighbors in the audience. That's not good for a first-time fighter. We learned that later on, because it increases your anxiety to perform well, and you burn up again. You're burning more energy needlessly, because you're anxious, and it's wasted energy. Well, the first 14 fights went quickly, because a lot of them in the first round of the Golden Gloves, you get all kinds of characters that don't even belong there. And sometimes the fights are very, very quick. They end almost, within the first minute even. So apparently these fights went along, and I didn't see them because I'm in the locker room, but they declared a intermission after the 13th fight. And I was the first fight to come out, number 14, after the intermission. And I come out, and now they have a national anthem with the flag and everything else. And there I am in the ring, and I'm waiting, and it's dead silence while they had national anthem. And right after the national anthem, my mother yells out, "Hit him for mommy, Rudy." And the whole place breaks out in hilarious laughter. And here I am, embarrassed as could be. To make matters worse, Louis Knowles was not an authorized or registered or qualified second with the AAU, so he couldn't be in my corner. They put in two guys that are there. The Golden Gloves pays these guys, trainers that are authorized, to be stand-ins for any kid that comes without a trainer in his corner. So Louis was disqualified. Here I have two strangers now in my corner, and I look across the ring, and I see my opponent, Ulysses Jimenez, who looks like a caveman. And he was banged up. He had a smashed-in nose, no cartilage. This guy was a sub-novice like I was George Washington, And looking at him, he had scar tissue and everything else. And I realized, well, this guy must be easy to hit. That was the good news. The bad news was that while he was easy to hit, it didn't matter. You couldn't dissuade this guy or punish this guy. He could absorb all kinds of punishment and just keep coming and keep coming forward and throwing punches. The fight was a war. It was hand-to-hand combat here, and it was a real barn burner. The crowd gave us, at the end of the fight, a very, very, very long standing ovation, and it was brutal. Well, the bell finally rang. The referee, the first thing he says, he doesn't vote. There are 3 judges that vote. The referee says, "Unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, there are no draws in amateur boxing. We have to declare a winner, although this fight doesn't deserve a winner." And he announced the winner, and it was Jimenez. It wasn't me. And the crowd went nuts, booing. And it wasn't just my family and friends, the whole place was. Well, it was a really, really tough fight. And when I walked out, I was met by countless people who wanted to shake my hand, and including after I changed into my street clothes and I walked out of the auditorium at the end of the night, people were waiting out on the sidewalk to shake my hand. So I knew I didn't feel defeated or that I lost, and I understood there was a bias. There's an inherent bias in the Golden Gloves. I was competing as basically an unattached fighter because I wasn't under the PAL. I was under the 109th Precinct, which wasn't affiliated with the PAL. And they have a bias towards clubs. It's a small bias, but, if things are pretty even, well, the benefit of the doubt was going to go to the person with the club because that mattered in the club standing. So who knows what really, what could have happened. The next 3 years, I kept boxing. I boxed in Astoria Park, in tournaments, the 54th Street Gym, the Broadway Gym in Bed-Stuy, where I learned. I was only one of 3 white guys in the gym, and I learned very, very well a good lesson in what it means to live as a minority. And it was an eye-opening lesson, and it stood me well for the rest of my life. I understand what it is. We used to go to the Broadway Gym. I used to go by subway from where I was in Queens all the way to Bed-Stuy in Brooklyn. And to get through the subways unharmed in tough neighborhoods, I would make sure when I carried my gym bag, my boxing shoes or my headgear or my gloves were exposed outside, attached to the handles of the bag, which got you through the subway unharmed. No problem, because the subways were even a tough place to go when you were in those neighborhoods. I went on, and thanks to Lou, he got me work as a steam fitter, which helped me in the summertime and in winter recesses to earn enough money to get myself through college and get a degree at St. John. I learned also that I wasn't the toughest guy in the world. I learned to have self-respect because I could endure and apply myself and persevere in a disciplined way. And I learned what King George used to say in World War II to the British people, how to keep calm and carry on. And those were some of the most valuable lessons of my life that have stood me well, even into this late date and the winter of my lifetime. Thanks for listening. Come back next week for another episode of Uncommon Law, lessons they don't teach in law school. I'm Judge Rudy Greco. Court is adjourned.